Welcome to Peace Now. My name is Trudy Quaife. I'm a member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. We're a local organization of friends and neighbors, and we've been advocating for peace and justice for well over a decade. I'm your host today, and I'm joined by Angelica Clarke. Thank you for being here, Angelica.
Thank you for having me.
Angelica is a local community activist. She's also executive director of the Albany Social Justice Center, and she's a co-founder of Capital Area Against Mass Incarceration, among many other activities. You're a community organizer. Can you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to become an organizer?
There were definitely a few things. I think that initially I started to organize because I was in school in Texas, in college, and I joined the Brazos County Against the War coalition there, and started to organize because my father was in the military, and he actually passed away in the military, and I always had that anti-war sort of attitude in me. And then I came to college and discovered, you can join groups about that. You can actually organize and teach people about imperialism and about the different things that go on. And then I came out here, and I came out here because my older sister was living here, and she has two sons, growing up in Albany and having two black children living here. Immediately I start to think about what's their future going to be like. And that draws me to the movement against mass incarceration, because ultimately, like, the school is sort of designed to push them into a prison. They're, as a low-income family, they're not necessarily going to be offered the same opportunities as other people who are not young black men or young black women in this country, and even in this city, in this county. And that really draws me to this movement, because I want to make sure that they have a future and that they're not just being funneled into prisons, or their friends and family, or mine.
Mm-hmm. What sort of projects are you working now on, and what organizations are you working with?
So I'm working with mostly the Capital Area Against Mass Incarceration group, and I'm on the Public Action Coordinating Committee, and basically what we do is sort of plan these public direct actions that sort of target the issues that we're working around. So there's we've done actions around the raise the wage, around the passage of the Gender Expression Not Discrimination Act. There was, for the State of the State, we did a direct action where 21 of us got arrested out front of the sort of State of the State building, because we wanted to make sure that these issues are going to be on the table, because oftentimes it's easy for legislators to ignore folks who are in prison and their families because they're low income and they're sort of people that you can just discard in society. But really, we're trying to say that that's not acceptable, and that's not working for us. So I'm working with that group. And we have quite a few different sort of allied organizations. There's an organization called Education from the Inside Out Coalition, mm-hmm. and they are focusing on the Ban the Box initiative, and also the restoration of TAP for people who are in prison. And mm-hmm. Ban the Box is basically like banning the box that universities have when you go to apply, that asks if you've ever been convicted of a felony. And essentially that's a way to box people out of education. Someone who's already gone to prison, who's already supposedly served their debt to society, is now being punished again, mm-hmm. For being marked a felon and always having to check that box for the rest of their lives because of that. So that's another group that we're working with that hopefully we'll see some change with that soon.
Mm-hmm. Well, that kind of leads us to the Black Lives Matter movement. Could you just explain a little bit about what started that and what that's about?
Sure. The Black Lives Matter movement comes from some folks, the Black Lives Matter Collective, and they formed after the George Zimmerman verdict. The man who killed Trayvon Martin, was sort of let off for having killed him, and continues to terrorize people to this day, right? But they sort of formed because that moment, I think, for a lot of people, was a moment that we all came together around the idea that there is an epidemic in this country, and it's an epidemic where black people are being killed without any recompense, right? Any sort of punishment from the system or any acknowledgement socially, right? Like there are so many stories that we now know about because this sort of Black Lives Matter movement has grown, that is happening all the time, right? Every 28 hours is sort of the refrain from the folks at the Malcolm X grassroots movement, that every 28 hours a black person is killed in this country by a vigilante, police officer or a security officer. And all of these killings are backed by the state, which means that there really is the only recourse that can be taken is to build mass movements and organize against it.
And also tied in with that is this "I can't breathe" slogan that we see everywhere. I saw the video where Eric Garner was wrestled to the ground and choked, and he said, "I can't breathe." What happened after that? How did that become the slogan of the movement? If that's what it is.
I think it became a slogan because one, because a lot of people also saw that video, but I think also the Peace Poets wrote a song, and everyone learned that song, right? Like it became a protest anthem for a lot of people around, like, that we can't breathe and that we can no longer wait. We have to join this movement now. There's an urgency that comes with this, like this sort of videoed moment of him saying "I can't breathe," and immediately sort of people can relate. Black people in this country can relate because oftentimes you feel like you can't breathe. You feel like you're suffocating, against all the oppression that's around you and all the systems that are working against you. So that immediately, I think, was something that people latched onto because it's a very relatable moment. That one, sort of your needs are disregarded. So even if you express that you can't breathe, that you're suffering, that you're struggling, no one is going to acknowledge it, right? Because your suffering is not equal to that of other people in this country, because you're a person in this country who's Black, right? So that's and we're unfortunately, right, dealing with a system that's built on white supremacy. So I think that sort of was adopted because it is so personal, and it is such a sort of unfortunate and sad reflection of what people's experiences are every day.
So this brings me to the question of, is racism the only thing wrong with our criminal justice system?
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, the criminal justice system, the prison system is not just racist, it's sexist, it's cis-sexist, it's classist. Like, people who are in prison are predominantly in this country Black and Latino, but also predominantly low income. People who are either people who are in the underclass, the unemployable people that the economy has decided there is no place for you anymore. Because whatever, Walmart needs to accumulate more profits, so there's no, or any other gigantic corporation. So I think that the criminal justice system is one place where, though, it does very, very much so disproportionately affect Black people, and racism is a big part of why, why we have the sort of sideways drug laws that we have, why we have the penalties that we have on certain crimes, and why we have certain communities who are surveilled more heavily, which is what puts a person in prison, is contact with the police. And if the police are nowhere to be found, then you're not going to be, in trouble for, say, drug use or even, drug trafficking, any of those things. But if you're in a community that's so heavily surveilled all the time by police departments with cameras and all these different, mechanisms for surveillance, you're more likely to be put in prison. And that is a racialized issue, because where you live is a racialized issue, because sort of we're currently living with the after effects of legalized segregation, and people still live in the communities that they lived in, when that was legalized, and now it's illegal, but it's still informally in practice. What people are experiencing. So that people are still living in segregated communities, and those communities are still getting surveilled by police, and they're getting put in prison.
And I don't think a lot of people realize this. I recently read an article, I've forgotten the source, but according to this article, there are as many Black men in jail now as there were Black men who were slaves in 1850. There
are more in prison now in this country than there were enslaved in 1850 or 1860, and I think that to me is a perfect picture of what we're dealing with right now, right? Is that sort of there was the historical moment of slavery where people were brought over from West Africa to the United States, and they were enslaved, right, in chains, and that was socially acceptable, and that to us sounds so egregious now. And yet we have a prison system that is incarcerating 2.5 million people, and millions more are still under the boot of that criminal justice system, either via parole, probation, or the permanent life stamp of being a felon. And that system is much more pervasive than slavery. And that system also relies on slavery in a lot of ways. The people who are incarcerated are often forced to work for 10 cents an hour or zero an hour, you know? And that is the definition of slavery, that you're meant to work and the only thing you get in exchange for it is room and board, and often punitive room and board. So it's not like you're living in a cushy situation. You're being made to eat whatever sort of malnutritious food that they have available. You're being made to live in a tiny cell, and you're also being made to work. You know, that's very analogous to you know, sort of the chattel slavery in the U.S. And now it's even unfortunately it's even worse. That was actually, you know, sort of said at the Oscars, right? Like that's, I think, why this came out, you know, because at the Oscars, John Legend mentioned that there's more people in prison than there were enslaved in 1850, and I think that should point to everyone that we have to do something about this, because we all agree that slavery was an egregious time period, right? And like we should feel the exact same way about the prison system as we do about slavery. It's unacceptable.
Yeah, I agree. So let's talk a little bit about the organization that you helped co-found, Capital Area Against Mass Incarceration. How did that organization start, and what are you working on now?
So the organization started because there's a few folks in Albany at the Social Justice Center who who helped to found the New York State Prisoner Justice Network, which is a statewide network of different organizations who are working against the prison system and against you know, unequal policing. And there wasn't an organization in Albany that was doing organizing around this, and yet the Prisoner Justice Network was founded here, you know? So basically we were just like, you know, we think that there's energy and we're interested in doing it. So we got together and decided, you know, let's convene some people and see what we want to do together. People, advocates, people whose family are incarcerated, people who are formerly incarcerated, people who are in the legal system in some way as public defenders, or you know, sort of people that do prisoner services of different kinds, got together and formed this organization. And you know, at the beginning we were working on parole reform. So there's this bill called the Safe Parole Act, and that would essentially like create a clear pathway out of prison for people, whereas right now it's almost impossible to get paroled out of prison. So that was initially a big campaign for us, and then since then we've expanded, and now we're working on a bunch of different advocacy projects, things like Raise the Age, the Ban the Box that I mentioned, the restoration of TAP for the people who are incarcerated, you know, and just a sea of changes that need to be made. But there are sort of those specific bills, the Halt Solitary Confinement Act, which would, you know, ban solitary confinement beyond 30 days, because that is officially defined as torture by the UN, but is something that New York State uses quite heavily. New York State uses solitary almost, if not the most of any state. There are facilities in New York that are essentially total solitary facilities, even though you're not supposed to put someone in solitary for more than 30 days at a time. That's a standard practice here. So we're working on those particular pieces of advocacy, but then also working on growing, you know, and raising awareness with people around exactly what's going on in the prisons in New York, and how what's happening in our communities is feeding those prisons. You know, around like the school to prison pipeline, and particularly around the policing that goes on in the different communities in Albany and Schenectady and Troy.
Okay. We talked a little bit before we started taping. We talked a little bit about how our system is really based on punishment versus restorative justice. Could you briefly touch on that for people that might not really understand what our prison system is based on at this point? Yeah,
sure. So yeah, like we were talking about, the foundation of the U.S. prison system is essentially sort of a religious restorative period. Like that's what your incarceration was meant to be when prisons were initially founded, was that sort of your work and the time that you spend alone in your cell would give you time to reflect on what you've done, and then you'll sort of rehabilitate yourself. You know, which I think that to this point has become a very corrupted version of that, right? So now we have people who are put in solitary confinement, which we now understand to be torture rather than restoration. And we also focus on, for the folks who are in prison, we focus on punishing them. The system focuses on punishing them. And, you know, rather than trying to offer them opportunities for therapy, for rehabilitation, for anything that you might actually need to become a sort of productive member of the community that you were from, Instead, we put people in these horrible situations where you're likely to have, incidents that will traumatize you for life happen to you if you're incarcerated, rather than, offering therapy and opportunities to restore the relationship between you and the person or persons that you harmed, if any, right? For folks who are incarcerated for drug offenses, instead of putting them in prison, we could easily offer them, drug addiction services and like therapy and the sort of there are so many basic things that if you just spend a little bit of time thinking about it, there are some great alternatives that already exist to people being put in prison. And that would include sort of community restorative justice, where you and the folks that you harmed come together to try to work through and make both of you whole, or all of you, depending on the situation, whole after whatever happened. And what we have now is just a total removal practice that often makes it so the person can never return to the community that they came from, certainly not to sort of give back or restore anything and make anything whole that may have been broken by whatever they did.
So we need to work on making the punishment fit the crime.
Essentially, I think that we need to work on removing punishment from the equation. I think that's really the problem, is that like we imagine that that punishment is what makes someone do something different, but I think to change, but that's, I think, what we can clearly see that's not true. It's what makes people sort of change, right, is one, offering them better opportunities to begin with. So if someone is selling drugs or whatever, or stealing things or whatever the case may be, that's because of the situation that they're in, right? That's an environmental concern. That's there's no employment opportunities where you live. Or if there are low wage opportunities that won't let you feed your family. So you think of alternative ways to survive. And I think that's a sort of critical issue, is like you're not actually offering people an alternative, and yet you've created an entire system that's meant to punish them for not using the sort of mainstream way of making a living. And that just doesn't work, right? It doesn't work because it erases history. It erases the fact that those opportunities have been taken from people, and those opportunities for many were never there, because we're living in, again, a country that's founded on slavery, founded on segregation, and the idea that everyone had an equal chance and they just made the wrong choice is a false claim, right at the beginning.
Right. Well, it's clear that the criminal justice system is broken. Do you think it can be fixed through legislative changes, or what do you think we need to do?
I think that some improvements can be made through legislative changes, but I really think that we need to, at a community level, rethink the way that we interact with each other and rethink the way that we create justice, right? Like right now we think that justice comes from, going to a court and having a trial, and then the, jury goes guilty or not guilty, and that's what justice looks like. But that's not really true, because one, you have a lot of players in that space who can decide the outcomes. I think we see that quite clearly with the situations where police are not even indicted for having killed people. Almost always, they're almost never indicted. And that's because of the case that's presented before the grand jury in those scenarios. And then you go from the grand jury to the actual jury, and then it's the cases presented to them is what determines the outcomes, and people don't even have access to adequate legal representation to begin with. So I think we need to take a step back from that system and consider what it would look like to actually offer justice to people, on a social basis, and that requires people being invested in, the communities that they're living in, and it requires people actually caring about each other and giving each other an opportunity to make whole whatever was broken by, whatever incident occurred.
Okay, you were recently involved in a sit-in down at the Capitol, civil disobedience, and that was over, was that over a specific issue, or was that mass incarceration, or could you talk a little bit about that?
It was over a lot of different issues, actually. We had 18 points around issues of mass incarceration, and also sort of the issues that exist before that time. So a few, we, like I mentioned before, 21 of us got arrested during that sit-in, and we were demanding the sort of gender and the right to express your gender as you see fit, and as everyone should have that right, and that we need to be protecting that legally. the halt solitary confinement, ending solitary confinement for all people in New York State, removing all children from adult prisons, which New York is one of 2 states, North Carolina being the other one, that currently incarcerates children in adult prisons, and tries children as adults. And that's totally unacceptable, right? Like so there are some very basic things that are legal changes that could be made, but there were also qualitative concerns, and essentially values demands that we made around offering full employment for people, offering people the right, Black people, to exist without the fear of murder by police or vigilantes or security officers. Things that we as a society have to create the space for. That we need to, as a society, humanize Black people to the point where we're no longer accepting the idea that you can kill any Black man, woman, or child in the street or in their home, and that's not questioned. And that because it's very hard to exist in a society where that's the case as a Black person. It makes it difficult to imagine a future where you have children, to imagine the safety of your family and yourself, and those are very serious survival concerns, and that's something that I believe that we have the right to demand from the state, as in the sort of federal and state governments, that they secure those things for us if they expect us to engage and legitimize those same governments.
Okay. Well, that's a lot. Let's shift gears a little bit here. We're down to less than 10 minutes.
Okay.
So let's talk a little bit about the Social Justice Center. You're the executive director there. Could you tell people who might not even know what the Social Justice Center is, what they're about, and what you're doing there now?
Yeah, so the Social Justice Center is a place that's at 33 Central Ave. And it was founded in 1981, and it's gone through a bunch of different iterations as a social justice store, and now it's a social justice center. So there are organizations that do advocacy and direct service who make their home in the center, and then there are radical activist organizations that also make their home there. So groups like Capital Area Against Mass Incarceration have a home there. So many different groups: Peace Action, the New York State Prisoner Justice Network, the Worker Justice Center, Mommy Interpreters, Citizen Environmental Coalition. There's a variety of different issue areas that call the SJC home, and it's a place that I'm new to being executive director there, and we are looking to have more people coming in and learning about the organizations that do call it home, and finding new ways to participate and be a part of the activist and advocacy community in Albany. We're on Facebook and and Twitter, and there are easy ways to connect with us there. And then you can also just stop by. It's 33 Central Ave. We have open hours during the day, and we're always looking forward to having more people who want to learn about radical politics and the changes that we need to make.
Okay. All right. So what advice would you give to people who might be watching who would like to get involved but haven't been up until this point? Should they just stop by the Social Justice Center?
Yeah, I'd say stop by. I mean, you can even you can look stuff up. You can find us on Facebook. You can find these many different organizations that I mentioned online. They have websites. We have a website. You can email. It's AlbanySocialJusticeCenter.org. You can go on there and email us, and even if you can't come by during the day, we can give you access to the calendar, and the calendar's on our website too, so you can check out what meetings are going on, and you can always stop by any of the meetings that you see listed on there are open meetings, so you can always come by and see what's going on and see if that organization's a good fit for you.
Okay, we have probably 3 or 4 minutes left. There's a term that I've been hearing recently, intersectionality. And you used the prison pipeline term there before. I wonder if you could just explain what this intersectionality is and how it relates to the prison system.
Yeah, sure. So intersectionality is the idea that oppression intersects, and it impacts people differently based upon those intersections. So sort of the original founding principle for that would be the idea that you may be a black person in this country, and you may also be a black woman in this country. And those two things combine to make it so that you have to deal with racism and sexism in a way that that specifically impacts you, right? Like, that's a very specific sort of oppression that you're experiencing, because you're having to deal with the social baggage of sexism and patriarchy, and also having to deal with the baggage of racism and the very direct impacts of both. So essentially, that's sort of the easiest way to describe it, is that people who have different identities are dealing with different kinds of oppression, and the way that oppression operates not just intersects, but also sort of correlates and co-powers. So it's not that sexism or racism exist by themselves ever. They are always operating together. And some people have to experience that because they happen to be women, and they happen to be people of color at the same time, or queer people, or poor, or any of those things. So that's essentially the basics is that your oppressions intersect, and then they also help co-create each other.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for joining me here today. It's been just great to talk with you, and I hope you'll come back again and talk with us again about all these issues, which I think are so important and people need to know much more about. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. This was great.
Good, good. And thank you all for joining us. Please join us for future shows. One topic we'll be discussing in the future is how the continuing wars, are affecting our local and national economies. Thank you.